Can a university or college consider race in its admissions processes moving forward? That's at the heart of one of the many remaining Supreme Court decisions yet to be announced this term. Students for Fair Admissions is challenging the admission processes at Harvard University and within the University of North Carolina system. They allege Asians have been excluded at Harvard and that Asians and white people have suffered due to affirmative action policies at UNC. During oral arguments last fall, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson questioned an attorney with Students for Fair Admissions.
The rule that you're advocating, that in the context of a holistic review process, a university can take into account and value all of the other background and personal characteristics of other applicants, but they can't value race. What I'm worried about is that that seems to me to have the potential of causing more of an equal protection problem than it's actually solving.
After hearing from North Carolina Solicitor General Ryan Park on behalf of the University of North Carolina, Justice Clarence Thomas said,
I've heard the word diversity quite a few times, and I don't have a clue what it means. It seems to mean everything for everyone.
To that, and to Brown Jackson's earlier point, Park said,
there are many different diversity factors that are considered as a greater factor in our admissions process than race. We have a particular interest in recruiting and enrolling rural North Carolinians.
The universities insist race may be a factor, but it's just one, and that they've adhered to precedent here. As the Supreme Court has previously said, such consideration is allowed.
Well, the oral arguments broke pretty much as most of us expected. You had a clear opposition to the challenge coming from the left side of the court.
Jonathan Turley is a constitutional law expert and professor at George Washington University.
So Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, and in one case, Justice Jackson, really spoke strongly against the basis of this challenge. Justice Jackson participated only in one of the cases because she was serving on the board for Harvard during the relevant period of these actions. The oral argument was interesting to watch, particularly in the interplay between the lawyer for Harvard and the court. Chief Justice Roberts kept on needling Harvard and asking if Asian Americans simply have no personality, because according to what the challengers are arguing, Harvard created a test that included interviews and essentially a personality ranking. Asians tended to be graded lower on that criteria, which made a difference in how many of them were accepted at Harvard. And so Chief Justice Roberts kept on asking, what is it about Asian Americans that you think are not really competitive in terms of their personality or their contributions? And it's at certain points, Harvard sort of floundered on that one. The other thing that was interesting is that the general rate of admission remained fairly constant during these years. And they also pressed on that, how if you're doing individual decision-making, these percentages seem to be so uniform. So it was a very interesting argument. A lot of it came down to statistics. A lot of it came down to the veracity of these universities.
As you know, a group of liberal arts college professors signed a letter saying a decision that would not allow the consideration of race would make our academic institutions less diverse and, quote, would be tragic. They write, to fulfill the promise of economic and social mobility, we need to continue rectifying the systemic barriers that have kept so many talented students of color out of higher education. I wonder, as you listened to the oral arguments, how important was it to the case that Harvard and UNC needed to make, this idea of systemic barriers that needed assistance in overcoming?
Well, some of the justices pushed back on those arguments, particularly Justice Thomas, who did not believe that universities should be in the business of selecting people by their skin color or seeking to maintain this diversity quotient as opposed to maintaining high levels of educational standards. But there were also more nuanced arguments. Many of us have argued for years that the greatest diversity that we see in our classrooms, the ones that are most relevant and beneficial in classes, tend to be economic diversity, where kids come from. It's not necessarily racial diversity. I have many African American and other students of color who come from very affluent backgrounds. the most interesting comments for me come from the students from all races who are coming from impoverished backgrounds, rural backgrounds, areas that are not represented to the same degree at national law schools. So this is part of this ongoing debate. But really, one of the things that really played prominently in these debates is the fact that the court has always struggled with affirmative action. We've had decades since the Bakke decision in the 1970s, where the court just kept on flipping back and forth on whether race-based programs were constitutional. Technically, Bakke got rid of affirmative action in higher education. But universities, as you might imagine, are very creative, and they find ways around that. And what happened is that the court allowed for universities to consider race as part of an overall context. And what the complaint has been is that universities used that and maintained what is effectively an affirmative action program that Bakke rejected. And the really interesting moment, I think, came when justices reminded these schools that in cases like Grutter, the court was very uncomfortable with continuing the use of race as a criteria. And Justice O'Connor, in one of these prior cases, said that she did not believe that the court would continue to allow race to be considered in 25 years or whatever period she mentioned. Well, that period is basically run. The time is up. And so a number of these justices, including Chief Justice Roberts, said, look, you keep on citing that case. This court, according to O'Connor, gave you a period that's now expired. So why are you citing that case? We said back then that we wouldn't be comfortable right now continuing that type of criteria.
Yeah, I read that. That was a fascinating part of the arguments, that this idea that there are sunsets, right, that things expire at some point. A Harvard law professor, though, to your point about creativity, told the university newspaper that at a university like Harvard, not much would change, even if the Supreme Court ruled against considering race. And the College Board, in advising universities to prepare for this ruling, said, make sure you're applying a DEI lens, a diversity, equity, inclusion lens throughout your institution, and message to your students that your DEI policies still apply and will remain untouched regardless of the Supreme Court. I wonder, will much change, even if the court rules against considering race?
I don't think it will. I've said this for years, that the universities have shown great ability to circumvent these rulings. I think they'll do it again. Some schools, like the University of California, have moved against the consideration of any objective scores, like the SAT, because it interfered with getting greater diversity in their classes. Well, if you remove standardized testing, there's very little ability to prove affirmative action or race-based criteria because you don't have as many objective data points. So what's fascinating is that they've already started to put into place a system that will make it difficult for the next round of challenges. And I think what's going to happen is that universities are going to develop subtle ways of achieving the same result. People will write in their essays about what it is like to be a person of color so that the school will be aware of it. You're going to have DEI policies that actively, select students without necessarily mentioning race. And so those things are going to likely be used to negate a decision. But that still doesn't mean that the court would consider this type of ruling to be without value. Chief Justice Roberts has repeatedly said that the best way to end discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And he still clearly maintains that. So there's some on the court that want the clarity of removing this criteria from application processes.
Let me get your brief thoughts on a couple of other cases. One is considering Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, how congressional districts are drawn. This is out of Alabama. Section 2 prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race. Some advocacy groups said the way that Alabama drew its congressional map last time was discriminatory, that there should be 2 African-American heavy districts, not just 1. I wonder what the implications might be here for future elections and other states and drawing maps depending on this decision.
Well, there's a couple of cases like Merrill that you just referred to that could have pronounced impacts. One, as you noted, is whether the court will continue to narrow the Voting Rights Act and its application to states. There's also a case called Moore, where you have Republicans arguing that courts should have no role in their districting decisions under the Constitution, which refers to legislatures as setting these rules for elections. The combination of those cases could have a very big impact. A case that is probably my favorite of these matinee cases is 303 Creative versus Elenis. And as someone who writes a lot in the free speech area, this is, in my view, potentially the greatest free speech case in decades. And it is hard to overstate the impact of 303 Creative. See, for years, we've gone through this question of whether states can force people who do creative products like photography, bakers, web designers, as in 303 Creative, whether they can require those people to produce products for same-sex ceremonies or other types of events that they have religious objections to. And this was an issue in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that went to the court previously. The court took an off-ramp and ultimately sort of ruled in the favor of the baker in that case, but really left him dangling in the wind. 303 Creative is everything Masterpiece was not. Among other things, it went to the court raising both free speech and religion clause challenges. Some of us have written, including myself, that we believe these are really free speech cases, not religious cases, and it should be resolved on free speech grounds. Well, that's why I was happy when the court accepted only one question for 303 Creative, and that is free speech. So it could be now laying the groundwork for a major decision that will address this question of how far states can go in requiring people to essentially speak.
Professor Jonathan Turley, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you.